There's a story about a boy who seemed to have no possibilities in life. When he didn't learn to talk till he was 4. He couldn't read a word till he was 7. In school, he paid no attention to the teachers. He was always fidgeting, and he would ask annoying questions. That's the only time he'd speak up. Didn't play with his classmates. He would sit in a corner and play around with a pocket watch that he had. The parents began to despair, and they thought, well, maybe he's got some sort of mental handicap or something. And they tried putting him in a Catholic school. He was from a Jewish family. They thought maybe the discipline of the Catholic school would help. It didn't. When he was 15, he was kicked out of high school because they just couldn't do anything with him. His parents thought, well, maybe if he goes to a technical school, they could teach him some kind of trade. The technical school wouldn't even accept him. The boy's name was Albert Einstein. You recognize his name because he was considered one of the great physicists of all time, one of the geniuses. Most people's IQs are between 85 and 115. His was 160, 160. He won the Nobel Prize in physics. He became Time magazine's not only Man of the Year, but Man of the Century for the 20th century. He was that influential, and of course, physics owes to his insights what we know now about atomic energy, etc. Albert Einstein. People had given up on him, but he was still redeemable. And that's what Jesus is telling us in the gospel. Don't give up on people, don't write them off, because in God's eyes, everybody's redeemable. Now, we don't think like God does, and Jesus is trying to catch our attention about that. I think it's particularly true when it comes to things like forgiveness and trust. There's a difference between forgiveness and trust. We have to recognize that. We do have to forgive everyone. We can't trust everybody. Here's an example that makes it clear. Let's say that a husband is an alcoholic. He abuses his wife and his children verbally, physically. After a while, his wife, who's tried everything, simply has to move her and the children out of the house. Now, he might be very apologetic. He might have tears in his eyes, but she's learned too many times that he's just going to go back to drinking and being abusive. She forgives him, though, because forgiveness means that you continue to love a person in spite of what they've done. And the way that she loves him is by praying for him. And she would encourage him to find the help that he needs to become better. Loving someone means wanting the best for the other person. She really does want him to be a better person. She wants him to be able to break free from his alcoholism. She continues to love him. She can't trust him. That would be a big mistake. Trust is something that you gain. You just don't invent it and say, I think I'm going to trust you. You have to see that there's a reason to trust someone. Otherwise, you're back in the same situation with them, and you enable them to go back into their same, perhaps abusive way. A person has to gain over time the trust of another. I remember a man in parish that I was in. I thought he was the greatest guy in the world. He and I would go to movies together. He had been the manager of a movie theater, and so we enjoyed going to movies every once in a while. Found out from him one day he was no longer married. He hadn't been for many years because in the beginning of his marriage, he was that kind of a husband, an abusive alcoholic, and she had the sense to pull out of that situation. All these years later, he'd completely changed, but he still had not had the opportunity to go back to the family. I always prayed that they could. But forgiveness is very different from trust. Everybody is redeemable. Everybody can, with the grace of God, become somebody better. One more story. Matt Talbot grew up in an Irish family in Dublin, one of 12 kids. The father and all the boys were alcoholics, including him at the age of 13. He became an alcoholic. He was the life of the party. We dropped out of school. Of couldn't hold employment. After a while, his friends got tired of having to buy drinks for him. He would resort to anything to get drink for himself. He even stole the fiddle from a blind man to pawn it to get money to buy alcohol. When he was 28, he decided he had had enough of that. He went to confession. He took a pledge for 3 months not to drink. Then he extended it to 6 months. And then he was able to say, every day I pledge not to drink again. And he did. The rest of his life, he stayed away from alcohol. He went to Mass daily. He taught himself to read so he could read the scriptures. He got steady employment and gave much of his money to the poor. His name is one of those that's being put up for sainthood. God's grace touched his life, and he accepted that grace. So the lesson, I think, from today's readings is God does not think the way we do, but can we learn to think the way that God does?